clock on the wall read 11:30 p.m. Yongkang sat alone in complete, suffocating darkness. The only light in the $15 million Manhattan penthouse came from the electric glow of the skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him, framing his silhouette against the sprawling glass. 60 floors below, New York City buzzed with a life he controlled but rarely joined. Yellow taxis crawled through the grid like ants, and couples walked hand-in-hand toward late-night bistros. But up here, the silence was so heavy it felt like a physical weight. Yongkang sat on the black leather couch, legs spread wide, elbows resting on his knees. A cigarette burned between his fingers, the smoke curling upward into the shadows like an unsaid thought. He wore an all-black shirt, unbuttoned halfway down his chest to reveal the intricate tattoos that crawled up his neck and across his skin like armor. Each mark was a story of survival, a tally of the things he had endured to reach the top. He checked his luxury metal watch for the 5th time in 20 minutes. Where was she? He took a long drag, letting the smoke fill his lungs while his jaw tightened. His eyes were fixed on the front door like a predator waiting for prey to walk into a trap. Yongkang was not a patient man. As the head of the Kang Syndicate, he commanded fear and respect from New York to Miami. Men trembled at his name, and women threw themselves at his feet. But right now, the most dangerous man on the East Coast was sitting in the dark, obsessed with the arrival of his housekeeper. That fact made him angrier than anything else. The elevator dinged. Yongkang's entire body tensed, a coiled spring ready to snap. He crushed the cigarette into a crystal ashtray and leaned back, fatting into the shadows. He did not move, he just watched. The front door opened. Nadia Brooks walked in, looking professional and entirely too independent in her tan blazer and slim trousers. She was looking down at her phone, her thumb moving across the screen as if she had a whole world waiting for her outside these walls. She didn't see him at first. She took 3 steps into the room before she felt it, that crackle of electricity in the air, the heavy atmospheric shift that always signaled his presence. Nadia looked up, her entire body froze. Yongkang sat in the shadows like a statue carved from stone, the city lights behind him making him look more like a monster than a man. His dark eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her forget how to breathe. Coming home at this hour. His voice cut through the silence like a blade, cold, controlled, yet carrying a vibration that sounded dangerously like pain. Nadia's heart slammed against her ribs. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words died in her throat. Yongkang slowly rose, his tall, lean frame seeming to expand until it filled the entire room. He took 1 step toward her, then another, his footsteps echoing like a countdown. I asked you a question, Nadia. His voice dropped lower, his eyes scanning her unruffled appearance. Where were you? Hello, family. Before we continue, I would like to know where you are watching from. Drop it in the comments and also subscribe to this channel. Your support means a lot to us now. Let's go back into the story. The silence in the penthouse was a physical weight, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the clock and the soft creak of Nadia's leather bag as she stood frozen by the door. Seojin rose slowly from the black leather couch, his tall, athletic frame casting a long, intimidating shadow against the floor-to-ceiling windows. The unbuttoned collar of his black shirt revealed the dark ink of his tattoos, armor that shimmered under the cold light of the Manhattan skyline. He didn't look like a man who had spent 3 hours in the dark. He looked like a predator who had finally cornered his prey. I asked you a question, Nadia, he repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low rumble that vibrated through the air. Where were you? Nadia tightened her grip on her phone, her thumb resting against the screen as she struggled to find her voice. She looked professional and polished in her tan blazer, a sharp contrast to the raw, tattooed intensity of the man standing before her. Where I go on my personal time is none of your business, she finally whispered, her heart slamming against her ribs. I work for you. I am not your prisoner. Seojin stepped closer, the smell of expensive cologne and tobacco smoke filling the space between them. He tilted his head, a mirthless smile crossing his lips. Do you think I do not know you have been leaving this penthouse every Wednesday and Friday night for the past month? He asked calmly. Do you think I do not have people watching you? The blood drained from Nadia's face. The realization that she had been followed made her skin crawl, but it was the look in Seojin's eyes that truly unsettled her. A raw, vulnerable jealousy that he was trying desperately to mask with cruelty. You have been spying on me, she accused, her voice trembling. I have been making sure no one hurts what belongs to me, Seojin countered, his jaw tightening until it looked as though it might crack. The word belongs hung in the air, thick and suffocating. He was close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, his dark eyes searching hers for a betrayal he was already half convinced he would find. He wasn't acting like the head of a crime syndicate. He was acting like a man possessed by the thought of her with someone else. I do not belong to you, Nadia said, though her heart was doing things it had no business doing. Seojin didn't blink. The silence stretched, charged with the heavy electricity that always crackled when they were near. He looked at her like she was a puzzle he was losing his mind trying to solve, his suspicion fighting a losing battle against a desire he had spent 5 years trying to bury. Nadia stood in the heavy silence of the penthouse, the weight of Seojin's gaze pulling her back to the version of herself she tried so hard to bury. Before the $15 million penthouse and the unbuttoned black shirts of dangerous men, there was the south side of Chicago and a mother named Gloria who worked 2 jobs to ensure the world would finally be fair to her daughter. Nadia had almost made it. She had been a scholar, a brilliant mind at Columbia University with a future that smelled of old libraries and high-rise corporate success. But the world had other plans. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer is a hungry beast. It ate through her mother's strength first, then it ate through Nadia's savings, her loans, and finally her pride. By the time Gloria Brooks took her last breath, Nadia wasn't just grieving. She was broke in the way that makes a person laugh because crying takes too much energy. Returning to New York as a ghost of her former self, she had crashed on couches in Brooklyn. Applying for corporate jobs that didn't want a woman with a gap on her resume and an unfinished degree. That was when she saw the listing, seeking live-in housekeeper, $15,000 per month. To a desperate person with $47 in their bank account, the suspicious requirement of discretion and no visitors wasn't a warning, it was a lifeline. The interview with Dorian Wu had been cold and analytical, ending with a question that should have made her run. Are you comfortable working for someone who operates outside the traditional boundaries of the law? She had thought of the debt collectors and the sterile scent of the hospital where her mother died, and she had said yes. On her first day, she hadn't met a sleazy, older criminal. She had met Kang Seojin, a man whose presence changed the very air in the room, making everyone, including Nadia, straighten their spines. He had stared out at the city like it belonged to him, giving her only one rule: do not enter my office ever for any reason. For months, she stayed invisible, cleaning his custom suits and memorizing the scars that peeked out from beneath his sleeves, white lines on his arms and a jagged mark on his side that whispered of a knife. She followed every rule, even as the electricity between them began to crackle and the expensive gifts, the designer bags and diamond earrings, started appearing on her bed. She returned every single one. She refused to be his charity case or another debt to be collected. She was a Columbia ghost, clinging to her textbooks and her night classes in Queens as the only things Marcus hadn't been able to take from her. The tension in the penthouse was a suffocating mist, thick with the scent of Seojin's expensive tobacco and the unspoken accusations hanging between them. Seojin stepped into Nadia's immediate space, his tall frame looming over her like a dark fairy tale. His eyes, narrowed and lethal, scanned her professional attire with a possessive heat he refused to name. You think I don't know you've been disappearing? He asked, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that made her heart slam against her ribs. You think I don't have people making sure no one touches what belongs to me? Nadia felt the blood drain from her face, not from fear, but from the sheer audacity of his claim. She had spent months returning his designer bags and diamond earrings, leaving them outside his office door to maintain the only boundary she had left. She refused to be another asset in his ledger, another soul bought by the Kang Syndicate. I am a human being, Seojin, not your property, she said, her voice steady despite the electricity crackling in the air. I don't want your charity, and I don't want to owe you anything. Seojin's jaw tightened, a muscle leaping in his sharp cheekbone. He had reached the top by understanding the price of everything, yet this woman was breaking every rule of his world. He had sat in the dark for hours, driving himself crazy imagining her in another man's arms, only to find her standing before him with a defiance he couldn't crush. Nadia reached into her leather bag and pulled out a heavy, worn textbook, Principles of Financial Management. She held it up between them, a shield made of paper and stubborn pride. "I haven't been seeing a man," she whispered, the words cutting through his jealousy like a blade. "There is a community college in Queens that offers night classes. I've been taking courses to finish the degree I lost when my mother got sick." The silence that followed was different, lighter, yet more complex. Seojin stared at the book, then back at her face, his expression cycling through confusion and a profound, stinging shame. He had tried to buy her affection with diamonds, but she was building a future with second-hand books and night bus rides to Queens. "Why did you not tell me?" he asked, his rough voice sounding almost human for the first time. "I would have paid for you to return to Colombia. I would have given you anything." "That is exactly why," Nadia countered, her eyes bright with the natural glow of her conviction. "I am more than just your housekeeper, and I am certainly more than a monster's project." Seojin stepped back, looking off balance as the walls he had built around his heart began to tremble. He realized then that he hadn't just hired a servant. He had invited a storm into his penthouse, a woman whose mind was a territory he could never fully conquer. The silence in the penthouse on the second day of Seojin's absence was a suffocating weight that made Nadia's daily routine feel like a hollow performance. She went through the motions of cleaning, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying the moment Seojin had pressed her against the door and confessed that she had made him feel weak. Around noon, the stillness was broken by the low murmur of voices echoing from behind the cracked door of Seojin's private office. Nadia knew she should turn away, but the pull of his mystery was too strong. She pressed her back against the wall, straining to hear as Dorian's cold, dismissive voice drifted into the hallway. "He is getting soft," Dorian sneered. "He has been alone for 5 years since Yuna." The name was a sharp blade in the air, a secret Nadia had never heard whispered in these halls. As she listened, the history of the man who sat in the dark began to take a devastating shape. Yuna had been the daughter of a powerful rival organization, a woman meant to unite 2 syndicates in a marriage that would make Seojin untouchable. But the union was a trap. Yuna had been working with his enemies for months, feeding them schedules and safe house locations. She had planned to have Seojin killed on their wedding night. Nadia's hand flew to her mouth as she heard the rest. Seojin had discovered the plot the night before the ceremony, but not before his own bride-to-be's men had nearly succeeded in ending his life. "You have seen the scars," Dorian's voice dropped, cold and resentful. "The ones on his chest that he covers with tattoos. He doesn't cover them because he is ashamed. He covers them because he doesn't want to remember." The revelation made Nadia's knees weak. She finally understood the jagged marks on his side and the thin white lines on his arms. They weren't just battle wounds. They were the physical manifestations of a trust that had been murdered. Yuna had destroyed his ability to let anyone close, leaving him to build walls so high that even he was a prisoner within them. Understanding made everything more complicated. Every returned gift and every cold stare now made sense. Seojin wasn't just being difficult. He was terrified of the electricity she brought into his controlled, isolated world. As she backed away from the door, her mind spun with the realization that the dangerous man she worked for was carrying a trauma that was slowly poisoning him from the inside out. The atmosphere in the penthouse shifted from heavy electricity to a cold, clinical suspicion as Seojin's second-in-command began his silent work. Dorian, fueled by 15 years of resentment and the belief that Seojin had grown soft, moved through the shadows of the residence while Nadia was at her night classes in Queens. He was a man who understood that Seojin's greatest strength, his absolute loyalty to his inner circle, was also his most exploitable weakness when combined with his deep-seated trauma. While Nadia sat in a brightly lit classroom learning about stock valuations, Dorian sat at a terminal in the forbidden office, his fingers flying across the keys with the precision of a surgeon. He didn't just create lies. He manufactured a digital reality designed to trigger every one of Seojin's defensive instincts. He planted encrypted messages on a burner phone tucked away in Nadia's quarters, messages that traced back to the Philadelphia Mortys, the very enemies currently threatening their warehouses in Brooklyn. Dorian went further, establishing a shell account linked to Nadia's name, depositing large sums of money that appeared as payment for leaked schedules and safe house locations. He knew that Seojin would find these records undeniable, because they mirrored the exact pattern of betrayal that Yuna had used 5 years ago. Every timestamp was meticulously chosen to overlap with the hours Nadia was away, creating a narrative where her secret classes were merely a cover for clandestine meetings with the syndicate's rivals. By the time Seojin returned from the Bronx, exhausted and covered in the grime of a minor warehouse skirmish, Dorian was waiting for him with a file of compelling evidence. He presented the data with a look of feigned disappointment, watching as Seojin's jaw tightened and his eyes went cold. The walls that Nadia had slowly begun to crumble were reinforced in a single heartbeat. Seojin looked at the financial records, his mind flashing to the white scars on his chest. The intoxicating pull he felt toward Nadia now felt like a noose. He wanted to believe her, wanted it more than he had ever wanted anything, but his history had taught him that the more someone looked like something precious, the more dangerous they truly were. As Nadia stepped through the front door, still glowing from the excitement of her studies, she found herself walking into a trap of silence so thick it felt like a blade held against her throat. The silence in the penthouse was no longer the heavy, electric tension Nadia had grown used to. It was cold, sharp, and smelled of finality. For 3 days, Seojin had looked at her with a mixture of longing and a suspicion that felt like a physical blow, his trauma making it impossible for him to trust her word over Dorian's fabricated evidence. Nadia realized that if she waited for him to find the truth, she might wait forever. He needed proof so overwhelming that even his damaged heart could not deny it. She waited until the penthouse was still, until the city lights were the only witnesses to her betrayal of his trust. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she approached the one place she was never supposed to go, Seojin's private office. Her fingers trembled as she punched in the code she had memorized from a distance, 0427, his mother's birthday. The door clicked open with a sound that felt like a gunshot in the quiet hall. Inside, the massive desk loomed like a jagged cliff in the dark. She navigated to the computer, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she tried the same code again. It worked. She scrolled through the files Dorian had presented, her eyes scanning the timestamps of the encrypted messages. Wednesday at 7:32 p.m., Friday at 8:15 p.m. A hysterical laugh bubbled in her throat. Those were the exact hours she had been sitting in her night classes in Queens, times she could prove with attendance records and time-stamped portal submissions. She wasn't the traitor, the evidence proved it. But before she could celebrate, the office door swung open and the temperature in the room seemed to drop to 0. Dorian stood in the doorway, his face a mask of calm cruelty, holding a gun leveled at her chest. "I warned Seojin that you were too clever for your own good," Dorian said softly. He stepped inside and locked the door behind him, the click sounding like a death sentence. Nadia's blood ran cold as Dorian admitted to selling information for 3 years to the Morty family in Philadelphia. He confessed to framing her because she had made the boss soft and distracted. Nadia backed away, her mind racing. She had found the truth, but now she was staring down the barrel of a gun held by the man who had spent years poisoning the only home she had left. Dorian's grip tightened on her arm as he moved to kidnap her, intending to use her as leverage to finish destroying the Kang syndicate once and for all. Nadia's breath hitched as she watched the office door lock with a click that sounded like a final sentence. Dorian's grip was iron, his fingers bruising her arm as he began dragging her toward the door, intending to use her as the ultimate leverage for the Philadelphia Mortys. Recalling her mother's voice, a memory of survival from a tiny apartment in Chicago, Nadia waited for the precise moment Dorian adjusted his hold. With a sudden, desperate burst of strength, she drove her elbow into his throat, causing him to stumble back with a wheeze of pain. She didn't look back as the gun clattered to the marble floor. Nadia sprinted down the hallway, her lungs burning, and slammed into Seojin's bedroom, the only room in the penthouse with a reinforced door. She engaged the electronic lock just as Dorian's weight crashed against the barrier from the other side. With shaking fingers, she grabbed Seojin's private phone from the nightstand and typed the 3 words that would shatter his world. "Dorian traitor. Help." Miles away in a cold Bronx warehouse, Seojin's heart stopped when his screen lit up. The cold, calculating Mafia boss who controlled the East Coast vanished in a single heartbeat, replaced by a man terrified for the woman who had reminded him he was worth saving. "Get to the penthouse now. Full tactical response, he roared, his voice cutting through the warehouse like a thunderclap. He was out the door before his men could react, jumping into his car and tearing through the streets of Manhattan at lethal speeds, ignoring every red light and speed limit in his path. Seo-jin made the 45-minute drive in 20, his mind a chaotic blur of Nadia's face and the scars Yuna had left on his chest. He burst through the penthouse door with a team of 12 men, his own gun drawn and his eyes murderous. He found Dorian frantically trying to breach the bedroom door. "Dorian!" Seo-jin's voice was conversational yet terrifyingly calm, his eyes locked on the man who had betrayed 15 years of brotherhood. "You framed the woman I love," he stated, the admission finally hanging in the air with absolute, lethal certainty. After his men forced Dorian to his knees, disarming him and stripping away the last of his arrogance, Seo-jin entered the code to the bedroom, 0427. When the door slid open, Nadia was standing in the center of the room, tears streaming down her face. She threw herself into his arms, and he caught her with a desperate urgency, holding her so tightly he was afraid he might break her. In the wreckage of his penthouse, Seo-jin whispered apologies into her hair, finally understanding that his business, his power, and his money meant nothing compared to the safety of the woman who had brought him back to life. The aftermath of the purge left the penthouse in a state of clinical, eerie silence, as if the very walls were exhaling after the violence. In the wake of Dorian's betrayal, Seo-jin didn't return to the shadows. Instead, he spent the night dismantling the Morty family's influence, ensuring that no one would ever see Nadia as a point of leverage again. When the sun finally began to bleed over the Manhattan skyline, painting the floor-to-ceiling windows in shades of gold, Seo-jin found Nadia in the kitchen. She wasn't cleaning or preparing a meal she wouldn't eat. She was simply standing there, watching the world wake up, her silhouette finally free of the weight of suspicion. Seo-jin approached her, his unbuttoned black shirt rumpled and his tattoos stark against his skin, but the predatory edge in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, steady reverence. He didn't sit on the couch with his elbows on his knees this time. He stood beside her, their shoulders nearly touching. "I've spent 5 years building walls so high I forgot what it was like to breathe," he said, his voice rough with a vulnerability he no longer tried to suppress. "I thought trust made me weak, but watching you fight for your integrity made me realize that I've been the one who was scared." He took her hands in his knuckles still bruised from the previous night's work, and looked at her with an intensity that had nothing to do with jealousy. "You returned every gift I gave you because you didn't want to owe me," he noted, a rare, genuine smile softening his sharp jawline. "So, I'm not giving you a gift. I'm making an offer." He explained that he had already made arrangements for her to return to Columbia University to finish the degree she had been forced to abandon. Nadia opened her mouth to argue, her stubborn pride flaring for a moment, but Seo-jin shook his head. "This isn't charity, Nadia," he whispered, his thumb tracing the back of her hand. "This is an investment in our future. I want to see you graduate. I want to see you become exactly who you were meant to be before the world tried to break you." For the first time since she had walked into the penthouse, Nadia didn't feel like a housekeeper or a Columbia ghost haunted by debt. She felt like a partner. The status irony that had defined their relationship, the boss and the maid, dissolved in the morning light. As she looked into his dark eyes, she saw a man who had finally stopped waiting in the dark and had decided to step into the sun with her. 6 months later, the Brooklyn rooftop was bathed in the amber and violet glow of a setting sun that painted the Manhattan skyline like a masterpiece of glass and fire. The air smelled of expensive lilies and the salt spray from the East River, a world away from the sterile hospital rooms and the suffocating shadows of the penthouse where this journey began. Nadia stood at the edge of the roof, her white lace gown catching the breeze, looking like a woman who had finally conquered the world that once tried to crush her under the weight of debt and grief. Seo-jin approached her, looking every bit the lethal kingpin in an all-black tailored suit, though the predatory tension that once defined his shoulders had vanished. The dark tattoos on his neck were still visible, a reminder of the armor he once wore to survive, but his eyes were now clear and fixed solely on her. He took her hand, his thumb tracing the wedding band that finally solidified their status as equals. "I spent 5 years believing that love was a weakness that would get me killed," he whispered, his voice rough with a vulnerability he no longer feared. "But you reminded me that I was worth saving, not because of what I own, but because of who I am when I'm with you." Before the vows were exchanged, Seo-jin led Nadia to a podium where a velvet-covered plaque stood. "I know you didn't want charity and you never wanted to owe me anything," he said, his voice carrying over the small circle of their most trusted allies. "So, I wanted to make sure your mother's sacrifice was never forgotten. This isn't a gift to you, it's a gift to the world she raised you for." He pulled back the cloth to reveal the name, the Gloria Brooks Foundation. He announced a $50 million endowment to help inner-city students in Chicago and New York gain access to the higher education that Nadia had fought so hard to finish on those late nights in Queens. Nadia's breath hitched, her eyes filling with grateful, happy tears as she realized her mother's legacy was no longer a story of struggle, but a bridge for thousands of others. Seo-jin hadn't just given her a title or a ring. He had given her the power to heal the world that had once left her with only $47 in her bank account. As the city lights began to sparkle below like a million tiny stars, they shared their first dance as husband and wife. The girl from Chicago who had nothing and the Korean Mafia boss who thought he had everything had finally found the one thing they were actually looking for: a love built on trust, redemption, and a future where neither of them would ever have to sit in the dark alone again. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "I love you more," he replied, finally stepping out of the shadows and into the light of their new life together.